Folks, welcome to Carfax October 2017 October meeting. Carfax is the Citizens Audit Review and Financial Advisory Committee, and we're all volunteers. This evening we're following a special agenda to review the third quarter financial results for the township and also at least the highlights and differences of the Township administration's proposed budget that they'll be presenting to the board for its consideration. I'd like to highlight that the administration's preparation of those proposals was independent of Carfax. We have no influence on them, nor does the administration have any influence on Carfax and its deliberations as it tries to serve the township commissioners. Although it's worth noting that the finance director and now assistant township manager, congratulations Bill, is a non-voting member of Carfax and acts as a liaison between the administration, the board, and Carfax, and his participation in that by his colleague Bob Tate is essential to our operation. But I did just want to make that clarification. So, thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for your preparations and so forth for this evening. First order of business is approval of the minutes, which I circulated to everyone.
So moved.
Okay. All in favor? Aye. We're good? Okay. Please note the minutes were approved without change. And we're not going to do any project updates to allow for conversation on these two important topics. So at this point, Bill, let's get right into it.
All right, Ian, if you could fire up this laptop. We'll start by going through the third quarter results. And this is a little bit of a sneak preview of the presentation that'll be given to the Board of Commissioners on Monday night. So you're seeing this first. I'm going to, at your request, I'm going to abbreviate some of the detail or skip over some of the detail. Monday night, I'll go into that detail with the board. And at that point, the presentation itself will be posted onto the township's website and available there. So for tonight, it's just a presentation from an even higher level than I would normally give it. I won't go into all these bullet points, but this is typically what we cover with these quarterly updates. A look at the general fund, not just the quarter, but then how the fund looks year to date. And then a quick look at our sanitary sewer fund, stormwater fund, and how our pension returns are doing year to date as well. In summary, the general fund, similar to the third quarter. Not much has changed in terms of expectations or the reasons why the numbers are behaving the way they are. The taxes are at or above their targets, mostly in the Act 511 grouping. The real estate taxes are spot on or hit their targets almost precisely every year, just given the nature of the tax. The permitting revenue continues to be very strong as it was earlier in the year as a result of the Villanova development and a couple other larger developments that weren't necessarily as obvious because of the process that Villanova had to go through, but nonetheless, their revenues came in this year as well. Department earnings are right in line with targets with mixed results. Some are doing better than others. And police enforcement and parking continues to be behind expectations, just as they were the last quarter. On the expense side, revenues in total are slightly below budget, which is where we'd want them to be. And heading into the fourth quarter, there's no reason to think or assume that they won't end the year slightly below budget. Taking a look at the revenue in terms of numbers, the general fund budget is just shy of $34.3 million. At this point, we would expect to have collected roughly 91% of that, or percent of the budget, and we're actually at 96%, creating a positive variance of 5% or $1.9 million in round dollars. That's down slightly from the last quarter. Last quarter was 6% and $2.1 million. No particular reason why, just a mixture of results in all the different activities, but the expectation for the full year is still to end the year ahead of expectations by roughly 5%. Most of the reasoning behind that is the stronger business taxes. And while we anticipated the Villanova revenue, if you'll recall, that was part of the forecasted number. It was not baked into the actual estimated revenue. So it's showing as a variance here, but it's one that we know about. The last significant date was Monday of this week with the extensions. So October is typically an important month in terms of the last quarter. In terms of the overall year, it's still not as significant as the first 5 months, but it's the last month where any revenue really comes in. On the expense side, the full year budget is $34.9 million. We would expect to have spent roughly 66%. We've actually spent 65%. We have some larger positive variances in the payroll categories as a result of more than anticipated vacant positions that have remained vacant for larger portions of the year than what we had budgeted. And then some that became vacated for various reasons that we obviously could not anticipate. So those create positive variances. As we've discussed in prior quarters, the engineering, we're still showing the large negative variance there as we continue to catch up on our escrow program. But in terms of how the general fund is anticipated to end the year, we should be basically right at the budgeted amount. The one caveat I'll throw in there is, and I'll get to this when I get to the sewer fund, is we've had 3 sewer breaks this year, emergency sewer breaks. The estimated expense from those 3 sewer breaks is in the $3 million ballpark. The sewer fund did not have $3 million of available fund balance to utilize, so the general fund will have to pick up the slack, at least for the short term, with the anticipation being that the sanitary sewer fund will pay the general fund back when resources are available to do so. But there's a discussion with the Board of Commissioners that needs to happen first, not just with that situation, but also with a longer-term review of the capital program with our sanitary sewers. So that could have an impact on how we end the year in the general fund because some of the cash may have or will have to go to the sanitary sewer fund.
Excuse me, Bill.
Yep.
So what is the difference between the $3 million thus far incurred for these emergency repairs and what was available? And just get a sense for that.
I'll, if you could hold that,
Okay.
I've got that on a later slide. Mhm.
Okay, good.
Yep. So with the revenue and expense activity, this is the bottom line, so to speak. This is the cash balance in the general fund, both where we would project it, as shown on the blue line on the graph, and then where the actual cash balances are at in each of the months up through September 30th. In terms of actual cash dollars, we would expect to have roughly $18 million in the fund. We're up a little over 20. With the positive variance of $2 million and some change. And obviously, as is normal, we will spend down much of that cash balance over the next 3 months as we wrap up the year, mostly because our revenue generation's in the first half of the year. And then we do have some larger expenses in the last 3 months of the year with transfers to various OPEB transfers and transfers to other funds for capital and those types of things. But at the end of the day, we're expecting that the general fund cash should be slightly ahead of what we thought it would be. I'm not going to go into detail here. These are just part of the presentation, but they're the comparison graphs where this is just comparing year-over-year activity to date. So the end of the third quarter in each of these revenue categories for 17 compared to how it's been the last 3 years. Again, this will be posted to the website, so if you want to take some time and review it, feel free to ask any questions, both for the revenues and now the expenses as well. Is this on a cash basis? Yeah, the question was whether this is on a cash basis. This is entirely on cash basis, yes. The sewer fund, we would these are collected in the first quarter of the year, so the overall revenue targets remain as we've been reporting all year. We have done a little bit better this year in terms of collecting some past due balances. That's where the positive variance is coming from. We are, in fact, going to roll out an amnesty program in November and offer those accounts that have fallen significantly in arrears the opportunity to catch back up and not and waive some of the penalty and interest that have accumulated. The last time the township does this roughly every 5 or so years. The last time it was done, it was 2012. It's beneficial to the homeowners in a couple of regards. First of all, they get to catch up, and those who may not otherwise be able to afford to can get at least the principal portion of their past due balances caught up. And it also gives them a chance to satisfy the liens that have been filed on their properties as a result of the unpaid balances. So I would expect, we don't have them built into these numbers, but I would expect in November to have a little revenue spike as a result of the program. 2012, the program generated roughly $250,000 in revenue. So we could see that, I don't know if it would be that magnitude. Our receivables at this point aren't as quite as high as they were back in 2012, but at any rate, we do expect to realize some revenue there. But the graph, the small graph, the line graph on the lower right or left, depending on which way you're looking at the screen, that answers or addresses your question, Mr. Blair, with regard to where we would anticipate the cash ending. And it's just shy of being $2 million in the negative, which is what the general fund would have to pick up. In all likelihood, we won't send the exact amount to that fund to break it even at zero. We'll send a little bit more because we'll have to get through the first couple months of 2018 before the 2018 bills go out and are collected in April. So hopefully that addresses your question on the order of magnitude of dollars we're talking about.
It does. Thank you.
Bill, I have a follow-up question. When we look at the expected revenue for next year, do we anticipate that gap to be covered in full and the general fund to be repaid in 1 year or more than one?
Well, those are the kind of questions that we'll have to sort out with the Board of Commissioners. The discussion will involve variables such as how much capital do they want to allow for or build into the planning in 18 and future years. How do they want to fund that? Do they want to use cash? Do they want to use financing? And then what the sensitivity is to any kind of rate adjustment that may be necessary to make it all happen. So it could be something that's paid back over multiple years. If they were to ask me what my opinion on it is I'd like to see the general fund get paid back sooner rather than later. If nothing else, than to restore fund balances and get back to allowing the general fund's results to be pure of general fund activity and not getting watered down or lost to other fund activity, especially funds where they're intended to generate enough revenue by themselves to be self-balancing. So I would shorter-term payback would be better than long-term, but given the amount, I'm not sure that's going to be entirely possible. If the board does elect to finance, we can pay back the general fund with financed dollars, because at the end of the day, basically what we're doing is repaying ourselves for a long-term improvement.
So essentially, the answer is TBD until the board decides how much of that gap will be funded in the current year.
That's exactly right.
Thank you.
Another quick question on that point. In terms of the revenue generation for the sewer fund, do the powers that be basically just plan to cover expected operating expenses, or do they also include a buffer for emergencies, which one would think would be pretty regular?
Right, and that's an excellent question, and it's one that came up. We had a special Board of Commissioner meeting. The date's escaping me, but it was summertime. And the one item we did talk about in terms of capital was the sewer fund. I think mostly because the King of Prussia pipe had just failed, and we were just starting to understand what the magnitude of that failure was. So that was in the front of everyone's mind. What we had talked about with the board, and it was all discussion, no clear direction, but it was what's the best route to go forward? Do you plan a long-term capital replacement program and then fund it accordingly? There were some discussion around just fixing the pipes as they break. So really, the answer is if we're going to rely or react to broken pipe, and that's going to be how we maintain the program, we're going to need a lot of cash in the fund. And this year is an excellent example as to why, because there was, in a 3-month period, $3 million in repairs or a pipe replacement needed. And it's obviously impossible to predict. And given the type of revenue and the fact that it's billed and collected once a year in 1 month, there's no flexibility to adjust rates midstream. You have to wait a whole nother cycle to correct it. So if we're going to be on a more reactive basis, it's going to require higher cash. If it's planned, or if there's some sort of funding mechanism that the board is inclined to approve through financing in all likelihood, there could be a little bit more flexibility to get funds when needed, which then you would not necessarily have to carry such a large cash balance. But those are the heavy discussions that the board will have to kick around.
Thank you.
Bill, the actual dispersing of funds when you have to pay, various things, is there actually a separate disbursement account for the sewer fund from the general fund? Or
So yeah, the way that we're set up to pay our bills, so to speak, is we have one checking account that services all of the funds. So as expenses hit each of the funds on a weekly basis when we run our checks, the cash needed from each fund to cover that check run is transferred from the individual funds to the one, we call it the general checking account. And that's how we cover it. And then the system takes care of keeping the balances separate for each of the funds.
right. So is there an option to actually have the sewer fund, say it reports at the end of the year, to actually have it report with a negative balance, on the order of several $1 million, and, effectively, the other funds are loaning it just by virtue of it being a negative balance, as opposed to actually, transfer. And there's a difference between transferring cash as a loan and transferring a appropriation, in a sense, bailing it out.
Sure.
And the reason I bring it up is just to not lose sight of, once either a cash transfer is made with a loan or even worse, an appropriation transfer, the issue kind of can be overlooked.
Sure.
Not that anyone forget it, but it doesn't stand out as much as if, the year-end CAFR is going to have this large negative balance
Sure.
for the sewer fund.
So we cannot carry a negative cash balance. We'll have to correct that. But when it comes to preparing the annual financial reports, remember on the operating statement that other financing sources and uses, which transfers falls under that category, is reported after net revenue. So it'll be obvious when you look at the operating statement for the sewer fund that the net activity for that fund was significantly negative, and that it was corrected with some sort of transfer in. At the same time, there'll be an interfund payable and receivable set up between the two. So it'll be reported on the not just the operating statement in terms of the net activity, but also on the balance sheets as an asset and liability.
Your anticipation is that would essentially be a cash transfer alone as opposed to an appropriation transfer?
Yes.
Which the general fund really doesn't have that much to fund that anyway, so.
So all of it's been an internal policy that we adopted shortly after I arrived, is that the only kind of transfers we're doing are cash transfers, and they're reported as other financing sources and uses. We don't do appropriation transfers for the reason that you're stating, is that it could get lost or misaccounted for. So by doing the transfers in and out, it creates a much cleaner and more obvious paper trail.
And that still requires board approval even for that, I guess? Board of Commissioners approval, or does that not?
No. It's reported to the board, but again, we can't carry a negative cash balance in the account.
Right.
So it's something that administratively we correct. But in our reportings to the board, from something as informal as this type of presentation all the way to the acceptance of the financial reports, it's all in there.
Okay. But an appropriation transfer would require board approval to do that?
Yeah, through the budgeting process, which and honestly, it's not even something that I've looked into, but in order for the board to affect appropriations, they would have to adopt ordinances and have public hearings, and but still, even with that, in terms of how it impacts financial statements, it's still not the best way.
Okay, thanks.
Finally, the last fund before we get to the pension results is the stormwater fund. Again, this is another one where we collect the revenues in January of each year for that entire year. So this is the fourth year that we've collected the stormwater fee, and each of the years it has surpassed by a small margin, but surpassed the estimated amounts. 2017 won't be any different. The larger issue with the stormwater fund and now the sanitary sewer fund is the investment of those dollars into the systems. And those are things that, if you watch our board meetings, are constantly discussed, especially stormwater. And then finally, for the presentation is through 3 quarters, the pension funds, they had a good third quarter. And year to date, it's a little over 11%. Total for the 2 funds, and obviously the target I still have on here is 7.5, although the board adjusted that downward in September to 7.25. So that's actually something I'll correct before Monday night. But so far in 2017, the performance has done well. And that is the third quarter presentation.
Well done,
Bill.
thank you. Any other conversation about that before we move on?
Bill, I have one last question about the pension performance information. We're reporting that at third quarter, and inevitably, there are 3 more months left to the year. When will the board get a final update of performance on the fund that actually will impact the contribution that the budget will be required to over time to actually amortize?
Sure. The final numbers are put together in conjunction with the pension fund's financial statements. So we send over to Mock and Hop usually in January all of the activity, not just how the assets have done, but also the benefit payments and any changes in benefit levels there. And then Mock and Hop converts that all into the GASB-approved financial statements, and we get that back. So it's in the audited financial statements, plus I'll report it with the fourth quarter presentation in here. And then as we've talked about with how that eventually makes its way into the MMO, is Mock and Hop will record the actuarial gain or loss depending on how the performance did. And then that'll get incorporated into the next actuarial update. In this case, it'll be 1/1/2019 or 2019.
Thank you.
Bill, excuse me, on that point, Leo, were you referring to the investment results that were just shown?
The question was twofold. One was when will the final investment result be shared with the commissioners, but also when will the next MMO, essentially the impact of that return, be reflected to them as well. So it was twofold, and I think Bill answered the question there.
Okay, because I would suggest that PFM would be able to report on full year performance within a week or two of the end of the year. That's the kind of thing they keep their finger
Sure.
on, at least
Yeah.
informally. If
Yes.
we just wanted that one number.
Yeah, and that's what gets worked into this presentation here. So they'll get it obviously a lot sooner through this presentation than they will the financial statements. But the financial statements are just a little bit more accurate because they're building in all the accruals, which there's not many, but still, that's what we ultimately lean on as the financial gospel. Shall I move on to the budget? All right. So as I try to pull up the presentation here, I literally finished up the township manager's recommended budget document at about 4:30 this afternoon. So that's why we don't have hard copies. I certainly will get you hard copies if you would like. Hopefully for tonight, what we can do is, if you're okay with it, I'll step through the presentation that we gave the board. It has the major assumptions. It has the summary of numbers, and then we can go in whatever direction you guys would like from there, including as much detail as you'd like.
Please do.
There we go. So what I'll touch on then is the major revenue assumptions and the major expense assumptions, and then give a high-level review of where we think the 2018 general fund operating statement, what it will look like. We have the capital plan summary. In the sanitary sewer fund, the park and open space fund, and then the next steps. So the last three bullet points there before next steps all involve aspects of the budget that we're looking for direction from the board on specifically. Some of them are recurring, or the park and open space fund is recurring or has been since 2014. The capital plan and the sanitary sewer fund are recurring from the sense that we've been working with CARFAC or discussing this issue with CARFAC for years now, and we're still working on developing that long-term capital funding plan. Instead of proposing recommendations within his budget, the township manager is reporting the numbers as they are in the plan and asking the board which direction they'd like to go to fund it. But I'll get into more detail, but we'd anticipate that conversation starting with, well, let's look at the projects first, decide if we agree with that, which then will get us to a number, and then we can decide how to fund it. But we're expecting that conversation with the board to hopefully get going on Monday, but we're just never sure with the rest of the agenda. With the major revenue assumptions include no real estate tax increase, again for 2018. We define the revenue growth in the business taxes as normal. That's a little bit of a stretch, because if you were to put me on the oath and ask me to define normal for our business taxes, it would be difficult. Maybe regular or continued might be better. But 2017, we had growth in each of the last 6 years before last year kind of took a step back. Not necessarily in the fact that revenue decreased, but it just didn't meet the expectations that we had set out, which was the first year since the recession that happened. So next year, we're taking a little bit more of a conservative look or assumption with the business taxes as we did this year. So we'll see what happens. On the regular departmental activity, normal growth is expected there. We have a lot more control over that, especially in terms of our operating departments. And the permitting activity, not that we have direct control over who's pulling permits and what jobs they're doing, but the base activity has been strong for the better part of 7 or 8 years, so we're confident that that will continue to be the case. And then as we work on with you folks, we forecast some of the larger expectations outside of the regular permitting activity. So like Villanova with their project, we understand that there's some optimism with the King of Prussia site in terms of moving forward with the development there. Those kind of things. So those types of projects are not built into our base numbers. It's the regular, anticipated, predictable year-over-year permitting activity. And then in the sanitary sewer fund, as we just talked about, we're setting up the discussion to figure out how we want to balance that fund between the different competing ends for those dollars, between our obligations with RHM, our ongoing maintenance, and now the need for capital improvements, at least a little bit more regular of a program, as we've had a number of breaks over the last couple of years with 3 this year. Stormwater fund, no adjustment in the fee. It has been the same $29 per unit since the board instituted the fee 4 years ago. So 2018 will be the 5th year. And when the board adopted the rate of $29, when they established that fee, they said that it would not change for 5 years. So if adopted as presented, that will be the case. The board will have kept their promise on that front. And then finally, the Park and Open Space bond or fund. This houses the accounting for the 2 open space general obligation bonds that we have outstanding. As we discussed a few years ago when the open space at Ardrossan was purchased, there was the discussion of levying millage to fund the gap between how much revenue is generated through the realty tax in that fund versus what the new increased debt service is. The board is yet to levy any of that millage in the years since we've borrowed those dollars. We've had other sources that have been able to pay for it. So again, for 18, we're posing the question on how the board would like to go in terms of funding that gap, which is anticipated again for 18. On the, this is a little bit, you guys are a little bit more familiar with this information. But when we talk about the township's revenues, we have three of our big pieces of the pie between real estate taxes, the Act 511 taxes, and then all other. The reason why the all other looks so large is mostly because of the sanitary sewer and stormwater, which represents a little less than 7.4 million. I will note that 7.4 included an assumed increase in the sewer rent that we've since backed out because there have been some of the board members have been critical of those types of assumptions being built into the budget because the argument is that once it's built into the document, it's much harder to change, take out, or have any significant input on. So the manager is going in saying, look, we're not assuming anything. We're just going to tell you that expenses with the capital program and our obligations to RHM are much, much higher than revenues will be at our current rate. And there's a number of solutions that can be derived from that. But when this was prepared, we had, I have a break-even formula in the rate cell, and I had that active when these numbers were generated. So if I were to rerun this now, that sanitary sewer and stormwater fee number would be closer to 5 million or 5.1 or 2 million. But I wanted to point that out because that is one number that's a little bit different, and that's why.
So, Bill, when you talk about that delta between almost 7.4 and 5.2, how does that trickle down through the rest of this document? Because that's a pretty significant amount.
It won't, because that delta is specific to the sanitary sewer fund. And most of the rest of this information is presented at the general fund level. Again, because the general fund houses all of the operations of the township. So it's significant on this page, but to your point, which is a good one, it will not affect any of the general fund numbers we see throughout the rest of this, or any other funds numbers, just the sanitary sewer.
Now, Bill, if in fact there's an increased expense and the revenue is not there, would it by consequence do similar as, you know, the issue that we have this year that you were presenting about covering a gap that will eventually hit the general fund? Would that be true?
Yes.
In this case as well?
It would be a repeat. If the board doesn't have the flavor to increase the rate, then it's going to be hard to sit and talk about funding the capital improvements. So they go hand in hand. But what we do know is that the rate itself has been the same for the last 4 years. The RHM payments that we're obligated to make for sending everything downstream has been going up, as have the operating expenses with the 3 full-time guys that we have that maintain the system. So even if there's those variables that all have to be balanced out. But if we're not going to adjust the rate, there won't be any capital, and we'll have to make other adjustments to make sure that the fund remains self-balancing. The whole idea of fund accounting and having special revenue funds like the sanitary sewer fund, stormwater fund, the park and open space fund, all of the other funds outside of the general, the whole idea of the fund accounting is that those funds are self-balancing, that the revenue generated within those funds is sufficient to cover the activity in those. So 2017 is a little bit of an outlier because we had the 3 major breaks. But if we're planning for the long term, we shouldn't have any funds that consistently need general fund transfers. And if so, that fund should be abolished and the activity should roll into the general fund, because you're basically using tax dollars to fund that activity and it no longer meets the definition of special revenue. As we do each year, we show what the township's millage rate has been, and then we also show what the total millage is for all the properties in Radnor when you combine the school district and the county. The line graph, obviously, the township is the green line at the bottom, which is running parallel below where the county's at, with minor increases going all the way back to 2001. And then the school districts is the red line. As you can see, after the the significant adjustments to the millage rate coming out of the recession, the tax rate has been a lot, there's been enough business tax growth to not require any adjustments in the millage rate. The one exception in 2016 was the borrowing for the library and park and the trails. The board at the time increased the millage by the 0.1717 to specifically fund the debt service on those bond issues.
Bill, just want to clarify one thing here. I think I've got this right, but the chart, that's not a stacked chart. So in other words, the township tax, the green line, is that the county tax is not the difference between the green line and the blue line. It's all the way back from 0 to the blue line, right?
That is exactly correct. That is not a stacked chart. Yikes, that's supposed to be bigger. I mean, I could change, just if you wanted to see what that looked like, that's what a stack chart would look like to show the total millage.
Well, it flip things around. But I mean,
Yeah,
the key
yeah.
thing I want to make is that the county tax itself is actually higher than the township tax. And the school tax is way higher than the township tax. So it's not, you got, each of those comes from, the 0 line.
Right. Sorry, let me just adjust.
Just so there's no misinterpretation by anyone that may be watching.
No, that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
It's more of a comparison of where each of the rates are versus what the total is. All right, digging into the general fund, one thing that we wanted to show, show that we typically or haven't in the past is when we come up with our general fund estimates, this is how we start. And the same practice is used for all of the funds, but it's more meaningful in the general fund just because you have more activity. But we take the total revenue projections and then we start backing out debt is first, then our long-term obligations based on the priority those have been given by the board to fund those come off next. And then the capital expense is a little bit, that's half of it. That's the departmental capital number. That does not fund the pay-as-you-go piece, the infrastructure piece. And then whatever's left is what we're plugging in for operations. And then we're showing a net revenue of roughly $400,000 as it exists now. After all, once the operations is taken out. So when we say that there's sufficient revenues to cover expenses, anticipated expenses, that slide demonstrates how. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but this slide was showing was, I think you need to, there you go, now you're
Okay,
good.
when you get a chance, can you go back? I think it's 3 slides. Keep going. Yeah, okay, leave it that so it's not stacked.
Yes,
Okay,
yeah,
yeah.
we'll put it back to the way it was, right.
Okay.
Thank you. The purpose of showing this slide is not only to show what the trend has been over the years, but it's also to demonstrate, as the relationship of those 3 large pieces of our revenue pie to each other, and in terms of total revenue growth. So you could see that there is an upward trend. Revenues have been fairly predictable from 2014 and what we're predicting again for 18. The reason why you do see a small downtick in 18 is mostly because we're comparing the forecasted number for 17, this 36 million, which includes the one-time dollars from Villanova. So we didn't want to count that again for next year.
Bill, before you move on to expenses, how will any county level reassessment work impact the township budget over the next couple of years? I'm guessing, I don't know that 2018 will be affected, but how is that going to impact us?
Yeah, 2018 will not be impacted. I don't know how long the county is proposing it will take to do the entire reassessment. And I'm not sure if it's different here in Pennsylvania, but my experience with countywide reassessments, and we were able to go back to 2000 and 2001 and prove this out. So what happens is that most likely the assessed value of the township will go up. And then, actually jumping back to this slide, what we'll do is we'll do the algebra that says that with a higher assessed value, we won't need as much millage to generate the revenue needed to make the fund balance. As was the case the last time this occurred, roughly 17 years ago, or 19 years by the time this actually gets done, is that the millage numbers will come down, assuming the total assessment amount goes up. So what I don't foresee happening is the assessed values going way up and the millage rate staying the same. That obviously would result in a pretty big tax increase for the payers. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is set the millage at the level that is needed to generate the revenue to balance the fund. So if the assessments go way up, the millage can come down, so long as we're generating the roughly $12.5 million we need from real estate tax to balance the budget. On the expense side, things are a little bit more predictable than they've been in the past. We have a board-approved organizational chart that occurred earlier this year, so we know exactly the head count to budget for. Wages for both of our unions are set through 2021 or 2022, depending on the union. So we have a few years of labor peace with known increases at 2 3/4, and we assume up to 2 3/4 for the non-union civilian folks, as we've done in the past. For the non-union folks, it's based on performance at the township manager's discretion. There's not a whole lot of variance generated in that regard for two reasons. First of all, most of the folks earn the 2 3/4. And second of all, there's just not that many folks that even if there were no increases, it wouldn't generate that big of a savings anyway. Most of the staff is in one of the two unions. Healthcare, and I pointed this out to the board. Right now, the number's showing a slight increase over our numbers in 17. I've been so busy putting the budget together, I really haven't had a chance to go in and drill into those numbers with some more detail. I was anticipating that being a reduction because of the new healthcare program that all the civilian folks are participating in. It might be that we are realizing that decrease, but at the same time, remember there's a number of vacant positions that we're budgeting to be filled. And the assumption with refilling those positions is that those folks are coming on with families and we're having to fund that. So it's a worst case scenario in terms of a number. So I'm wondering if the replacement of those positions is causing the healthcare number to go up versus what it was for 17, even with the anticipated reduction in the premiums. So right now it's at a 2%. I'm confident in saying that is worst case. That if anything, it'll do better than that. But it is something that I need to spend a little bit more time on between now and when the budget gets adopted, just so I can be 100% certain as to why. Because like I said, I was anticipating that going down. The pension, the MMO, is showing a decrease of roughly 5%. And again, that's a known number as the board adopted the MMO for 18 at the second meeting in September. Now, the board can change that if there are significant payroll adjustments through the payroll process, but it's a known number right now. And it's even more known because the actuary, the ink is barely dry on those. So the numbers are never more fresh than they are when we just get the actuary and build it into the next year budget. The OPEB funding plan, this is year 5. So the additional 200,000 brings the ramp-up amount coming out of the general fund to an even million. The reason why we're transferring $1,059,000 and some change is, if you'll recall, part of the plan was that two things. First of all, we're going to pre-fund any employees that we hire from 2013 on that are eligible for the benefit, which police officers are eligible, just the officers now, not their extended families. So the obligation's a little lower, but we are pre-funding those folks. That's not in this number. The $59,209 represents the increase as a result of 2 disability retirements that occurred back in 2016. So we are basically treating the OPEB funding plan like we would the pension. We've taken an actuarial loss that was not part of the original plan, and we're amortizing that based on the numbers that Mock and Hop gave us.
Bill, do you have a feel for, off the top of your head, what the number is for the new police officers? Because there's a significant number of them now.
Yes, we're using $25,000 a year for each officer. And I think the budget number for 2018 is 375,000 to 400,000. One of those two numbers. It was toggling because of some personnel movements, but it's that much.
Okay, so it's pretty significant even in light of the $1 million, so, yeah.
Yeah, so the pay-as-you-go piece for today's retirees that we're funding their health care on is roughly 2.5 to 2.75 million. And then you add another $1.5 million on top of that. That's our total OPEB expense for 2018.
And Bill, just to clarify, the bullet says year 4 of the funding plan. Is it the 4th year or the 5th year?
No, this will be the 5th year.
Okay.
The math tells us that it's the 5th year. That's a typo.
That's what I
That's a
thought.
good catch, yes. That should say year 5. Then we get to the capital funding plan. The way the budget has been built to this point is that the pay-as-you-go piece is being funded with current resources or general fund transfers, as has been the case for the last few years. And then, as I've touched on a number of times tonight, the pay-as-you-use portion is, we're looking for some more discussion and direction from the board. To that end, there are a couple other board direction type of decisions that we're looking for. The Radnor Fire Company has, so let me back up. We met with each of the organizations that the township contributes dollars to. We had those meetings in August and early September in anticipation of putting the budget together. So the Radnor Fire Company is looking for an increase or an additional funding of $200,000 per year. I'm not picking on them, but I did note that that is in addition to the increase of 125 that was built into this year's budget, because I didn't want anyone thinking that it's only a $75,000 increase. It would be on the sum if it were to be included in the budget of 325,000 additional dollars in 2 years. The 125 was to balance the ambulance, the ALS program. And without going into too much detail, the bottom line is that the overwhelming majority of the folks that require ambulance care are on Medicare, and Medicare reimbursements for that service have been declining. So what they thought they would be getting from that program has actually been going down, and it's caused a gap. The $200,000 that they're requesting now is to start or is to fund full-time firefighters, which is the other branch of the fire company house or tree. Their volunteerism is way down. They're running short of folks to respond to calls for service. And ultimately what that means is that they're going to have to pay people to come in. They don't have the resources themselves to generate that kind of money to pay for those folks. So it's falling back on the township to consider. So at this point, it's a request from the fire company. We're pointing it out here. There'll be more discussion during the budget process, and we'll see where it goes from there. In terms of our organizations that we give money to.
Bill,
Yes, sir.
on the fire company, so then how much are they requesting in total?
That's a number I don't have memorized. It's
The suggestion then is just have it in there for the presentation
Okay.
for when you go before the commissioners.
very good.
And I guess while we're on that, I'll throw out one other question. So I did see when this was presented to the Board of Commissioners earlier in the month, and it jumped out at me. And I think, what should particularly be paid attention to here is not just thinking of it as 200,000, but it's opening up a whole new category of spending.
Yep.
So just as, I guess it was last year, this 125,000 was added. Again, that was, it's not so much it's just 125,000, but it's now the township taking on the responsibility for subsidizing the ambulance service. And, that's a big leap to go from not doing that to doing that. And this one's probably even on a scale much greater than that, with now starting a process or a program where the township is subsidizing full-time firefighters. So certainly a huge need, but it's not, the 200,000 is one thing, but it's really opening up a whole new category of funding that the township has not taken responsibility before and could significantly grow in the future. So, from my perspective, at least one thing is to do some projection on what's the anticipation in the future. I think looking at it only from, hey, it's just 200,000 for next year, my thought is that should be looked at, at least with some, at least part of the 5-year projection in the 5-year capital plan. But again, just pointing out, to the extent anyone is watching this meeting, that it's opening up a whole new category of funding. It's something that I know we've talked about from time to time, that this was coming. We've probably been talking about it for, the 6 or 7 years Carfax been in existence. So here it is, and it should be treated, accordingly with that rigor.
Good points. And I can speak from experience in my past life. It was a Monday morning, we had a total volunteer. Well, it was volunteer with a little bit of paid part-time. That was Monday. Then on Tuesday, it was a full-time fire department, completely paid staff. And it had a significant impact on the budget. In terms of our funding of other organizations, for those that we do increase annually, we're proposing roughly 2 3/4 for the seniors, the Surrey, and the art. The reason why the percentages aren't precise is because we're getting into some funny numbers. So for the sake of sanity, we just rounded those off.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I had a follow-up question on the fire department issue.
Oh, sure, yeah, sorry.
Do you have a sense for, it sounds like the fire department, a vital element of public safety in our township, is understaffed for lack of volunteers. Do you have a sense of what the appropriate number of volunteer or full-time people would be, kind of anticipating possibly down the road, we would need X number of firefighters, et cetera, and how that might compare to the size of our existing public safety, the police department? Would
Well, hopefully we don't need
be as large or
43.
smaller, or, I'm just,
Yeah.
some order of magnitude there.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and as I sit here now, I don't. The fire company does. I mean, they know exactly how many folks they need. They know when they can anticipate greater availability. They know when they're going to be short-staffed. So they know. We'll have to lean on them. And to Jerry's point, if this is something the township is going to fund, yeah, we're going to have to plan for it, and we're going to have to figure out, if it's 2 firefighters now, when does it become 3, 4, 5, or more, and then, without getting too much into the political end of it or the board's level of direction, how much pressure is put back on the fire company to bolster volunteers? Are they doing everything they can? It might be that they absolutely are, and it is just a shift in people's willingness to volunteer. But those questions haven't been really asked yet. So,
Have we compared ourselves, whether it's Lower Merion, Haverford, TE, on that type?
the fire companies themselves, the comparisons are all there. How each of the municipalities funds their fire companies is a little different, and it's hard to draw apples to apples. For example, Lower Merion Township has to support 5 or 6 volunteer fire companies, whereas Radnor, primarily it's the Radnor Fire Company. We also support Bryn Mawr, and then a very small amount to Broomall. But in terms of the fire company staffing and the volunteerism, those comparisons do exist. But those are the types of things that'll be flushed out when we have the larger discussion about how serious we are of getting into this business. The last thing on this slide is the jump in the library. The 6%, or roughly 50,000, is, if you'll recall, 2017, their funding was decreased a little bit as a result of the anticipated savings they'd realized by not being fully staffed during the improvements. So for 2018, it's expected that the library will be complete in December this year. So for next year, we're anticipating them being back to what would be a regular year. So we're restoring that funding back to what would be a more regular amount. This is taking a look at our debt service. As you guys are aware, different funds share a different percentage of the obligation based on what the borrowed dollars were used for when they were initially borrowed. So if the township borrowed money to do a sewer project back when the funds were borrowed, the sewer funds the sewer funds helping to pay for that. So that's where we get the different breakdowns. The Park and Open Space Fund, that is solely open space bonds, which, as you're aware, there's 2 current outstanding bond issues, the latest being issued in 2014. But the township's total debt service for next year's declining by roughly $200,000. Most of that's in the Park and Open Space Fund. Actually, the general fund's overall share is going up by a very small amount. But then in future years, as you guys know, it starts ramping back down. But this is to show what the township's total debt service has been over the same years that we're showing a comparison for, and what each fund's obligation is. To that point about demonstrating future years, we know that in 2 years we're going to see a large reduction in total debt service. The general fund will realize some of that. The sanitary sewer fund will realize a smaller share of that, in the special assessment fund an even smaller share of that. But I wanted to point that out. I did point it out to the board, and as you're aware, if we're talking about financing debt or financing for the long-term portion of the capital program, funds will become available in the next couple of years without increasing expense. The opportunity to borrow money is a possibility. And do you mind if we take a 2-minute break? So Ian, we'll be back in 2 minutes. I'm drinking water all day, so I apologize. All right, Ian, I think we're going to get going. We did notice on the placeholder screen that financial was spelled a little different than we would normally spell it, but we'll get that fixed, I'm sure, right away. Yeah, it may be fixed by the next break. So when we take a look at all of the expenses of the general fund, again, we showed a similar slide on the revenue. I won't spend a lot of time going into the details of this number versus that, but you could see quickly what the makeup is of the expense. By and large, it's payroll and related, and then everything else is stacked on top of that. And then also from at least 2014 through what we're budgeting for 18, total expenses have grown, but not wildly. The one thing that may throw this number off a little bit for 17 is if the general fund has to transfer, or when the general fund has to transfer money to the sewer fund. Again, since this is on a cash basis, you're going to see the forecast for the general fund transfers jump, which will cause the 35 million here to jump. But going back to Leo, your point earlier, as long as the fund in future years is self-balancing, then this 34.9 or 35 million will be won't be affected, or won't require future years transfers.
So, Bill, we have two canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, the fire department and the sewer fund, potential to blossom into red flags or problems.
Yeah, I
mean, that's one of the things.
haven't heard that
looked at.
expression before. I'm
Highlight here.
picturing what happens to the canary, but
It's not happy.
I think one is going to be much easier to solve than the other. The sewer fund, really, it should operate like a utility, and in cases where utility rates need to be adjusted, they need to be adjusted to fund the program. So it's just what level of program the board wants to see. The fire company, I think, is going to be a much more difficult problem to solve. But on the other side of it is that I think it'll take a lot longer for that number to grow, and I don't anticipate it being an overnight. So you got those two different variables. There's other issues. I mean, the funding of the long-term capital program is another big one. We'll get to that in a little bit more detail here in a moment, but we've been fortunate, given our revenue situation, that we've had excess fund balances that have bridged the gap and allowed us to install a lot of projects. Between that and the bond issue that the board did do in 2016, but short of excess fund balances, we're going to have a hard time replacing signals and replacing or improving the facilities, the buildings and grounds that we have, sidewalks, intersections, and those kind of things. So jumping back to our operating statement, these are the revenues minus expenses. As reported at the beginning of the presentation, we have a net revenue number. So we're anticipating revenues being a little bit more than sufficient. But I've also noted that there are some holes yet that need to be filled, or at least some decisions needed on some items that could chew up that number pretty quick. But Radnor is before I jump, but the Radnor is in a beneficial position versus a lot of communities where we're able to have a real conversation about not needing additional taxes and still balancing our budget. Yes, we do have things that we got to figure out yet, but we are still in a very advantageous position. So I won't go into a lot of detail here. This is basically a summary slide on our pay-as-you-go portion of our capital program. It's our moving fleet, short-term assets, which also include IT and includes the cable expenses, most of which happen in this room or for this room. The line chart here shows that our departmental needs, at least over the foreseeable future, is a pretty regular number. It's something that is predictable, and it's certainly something we can plan around, which is very beneficial. And as you guys know, it is something that we have built into the budget and have begun to plan for. What the township manager's budget is presuming is that this portion of the capital program can continue to be funded with current resources for this foreseeable future. And not, so basically, without making the policy decision, saying it's a viable possibility and alternative to do so. So when we're talking about funding capital in future years, we don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time going through this portion of it. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I don't want to be presumptuous to say, this is done, don't worry about it. What's being purchased in this group is definitely something that'll be scrutinized and evaluated annually. But from a financial planning perspective, it looks like there are enough resources to fund this portion of the program, which is not news to you guys. That we've talked about it for 2 years, but the numbers are demonstrating that that is real.
Bill, is there another question?
Yeah, I remember vividly understanding that we were funding police cars with a 5-year life, with a 20-year bond and so forth. And this pay-as-you-go is kind of a rational response to a policy that some people would judge to be inappropriate.
Yes. Yeah. Any accountant certainly would. And yes, what you're referring to, there was a period of time not too long ago where the township was borrowing huge chunks of dollars, 15 to 17 million bytes at a time, and funding its entire capital program with that, which included short-term, 3-year police cars. By the time we're done paying those bonds, I mean, those police cars won't even be recycled metal anymore. They will be off the face of the earth, but we'll still be paying for them. And so, yes, this program is a complete reversal of that.
And the interest on the bonds over the remaining 17 years would probably buy 2 or 3 more cop cars.
On one of the bonds especially, the interest alone could fund the police portion of this pay-as-you-go program. But it's also worth noting that we didn't get here overnight. A lot of times when we have these conversations, there's an immediate reaction of, well, this has to happen tomorrow. And this is a good example of, no, it doesn't. Again, we were fortunate to have revenues that bought us time that most communities aren't fortunate enough to have. But that speaks to the importance of economic development and making sure that we're able to redevelop our town when opportunities arise. But not all of these types of things are immediate or need to be immediate. So, but this is definitely one that is a successful portion of the evolution of our financial planning process. But again, I'm being hyper careful because I don't want anyone to misconstrue that as though we're saying, look, this is done, this is set, this is policy, we're moving on. This is still part of the board's evaluation, still something that they'll look at every single year. And any kind of capital purchases made out of this group will only occur with the board's approval. Which is a segue to the larger question mark with our capital funding. This is the pay-as-you-use group, or we're proposing that title, which implies that some sort of financing is used to pay for this group, because it would match annual financing payments with the benefit of the asset over a long period of time. And these improvements include assets that have long lives of 15 or so years, plus or minus. Which, as you can see by the graph on the left or right, depending on how you're looking at the screen, the largest share of what we're proposing, or at least is in the plan for 18, is our traffic control at roughly 2.7 million. I think that number is a little inflated, only because it's assuming we do a number of projects all in 2018, which is most likely not going to happen. Those projects will be prioritized and spanned out over a period of years. But for now, they're all in 2018. And then the other projects, the road and bridge consists of a lot of sidewalk improvements, as well as, if you'll recall, last year, CARFAC was actually involved in the discussion with the board advocating for the road replacement program to reach that magic $1 million number, which resulted in a life cycle of roughly 11 to 12 years for the township to get through all of the township-owned roads. And so part of that 868 that's in road and bridge is roughly 200,000 that is supplementing the liquid fuels fund that brings the funding for road replacements up to $1 million. And actually 2017 will be the first year that a full $1 million goes into the roads. So that's another program that I think is you could put in the success category, part of our capital program that is going to benefit the township for a long, long time. Again, it's not something that'll happen overnight, but over the course of implementing that $1 million per year, we should see the condition of township roads improve. Now, we know that we have a large share of roads in our town that aren't owned by the township, that we're relying on PennDOT for, and those are somewhat out of our direct control, and they're certainly not included in these numbers. The other categories are much smaller. The one we have Board of Commissioner projects. We've kind of created that category over the last year as commissioners have requested specific projects. We wanted to identify them separately to make sure that they were projects that were vetted by the board. And again, that's just to make sure that all the projects, it gives the commissioner an opportunity to request a project, but ensure that that project has to go through the entire, or through the budget cycle with the entire board before it gets approved and incorporated into a funded plan. So the way that this has been presented in the township manager's budget is right, the number is showing a $4.4 million need in 2018. Again, I don't think that we're advocating that the board come up with $4.4 million for all these projects in 1 year. As we've looked at over the last year and a half to 2 years, the pay-as-you-use group can be smoothed out with the right prioritization of projects to where we could probably land on an annual need, which will make finding a funding source a lot more, it will make it a lot easier. Or certainly limit the possibilities or open opportunities up. And we've talked about doing a revolving debt program where we're, as our debt expense every year falls through the natural amortization, we refill that back up to today's level so that we're not increasing expense, but we're generating some cash to do the projects. The question is becoming whether or not that gap alone will allow us to borrow enough to fund the program. Because one thing about the capital program is the more attention it gets, the more projects start bubbling up and surfacing. So while we think we might have our arms wrapped around the plan, inevitably there's another half dozen projects that come up. And next thing you know, we're looking at, instead of $1.5 million per year, now we're looking at $2 million per year. So that's where we'll get into the finer points with the board about prioritization and how they want to address that.
Bill?
Yes, sir.
Have you looked at how much you're relying on developer offsets and public-private partnerships?
Well,
I hope not too much.
no. In fact, none.
You shouldn't have it up there.
It's
'Cause
not.
historically, it's a,
Oh, well, we have it up there as a possibility, yes. But
well, it's a possibility, but it's highly improbable, given the past history. So I really wouldn't publish that, because it isn't going to get done. If it had been done in the past, that 4.4 million that's needed would already be accounted for, plus. What can I say?
Yes, sir. Sanitary sewer fund, I won't go into as much detail here because we spent a lot of time in the quarterly update. But this slide here does help kind of set the table or demonstrate the fact, or what is generating the funding gap besides the emergency brakes. But our revenue that is generated is based off water consumption, which you could see over the last 4 years has been flat and actually has declined a little bit, coupled with the fact that our rate has not changed from the $5.90 per 1,000 gallons over the same period of time. And then you could see that RHM, well, you can't see because it's too small, but if you were able to see, it's grown from roughly 3.7 to 4.7. So it by itself has grown $1 million in a 5-year span. So it's not hard to figure out, the pieces that are generating the funding problem in the sanitary sewer fund. And then you couple that with a huge number in 2017. And this presentation was put together before the third line broke. So that number is a little understated there with the 2 million. But you could see why we're in the position we are with that fund.
Have you run any numbers to calculate what the rent rate might want to be to cover, to recoup the going in the hole, plus a higher level that would take care of at least RHM's extra $1 million and so forth?
So the only break-even number that I've run is one that includes the capital, a funding of a capital program. I have not run it at different increments. So I would want to stop short of putting that out there in a public forum, because somehow those things just have a tendency to get legs and run full speed, and I'll be reading about it in the paper. But that's a good point. That's probably the incremental number would be a good set of numbers to run, because right now it's just a holistic one. But that's something that I can definitely be prepared to discuss.
Bill, was there more on the, I had a couple of thoughts, but I'll wait till you finish up the sewer fund.
Okay, that's it for the sewer fund. Well, this is just demonstrating that, so this was a look back from 14 through 17. This slide is showing what we're budgeting for 18 through 2022, just to demonstrate that without, well, two things. First of all, it's incorporating a much higher level of planned capital improvements, but it's also saying that given what we're paying to RHM and what we're charging, there's a shortfall in each of the years that's pretty significant.
Yeah, so the couple of thoughts, and again, I saw when you presented this to the board. I think this might be an interesting project for Carfax to offer to take on. So I'm not looking at you, but really looking at, if we get that message to the board. I don't know how much we could do for this year, But, in fact, this is something, just like the fire company before, this is something we've sort of had, we've been talking about and watching over the years and knew the day would come for this as well. So, there's a lot of interesting things here. I started, now that I'm not looking at pensions at the moment, I was doing a little bit digging in, and, the RHM is Radnor, Haverford, Marple. So,
Yes.
the first thing, what's Marple charging? What's Haverford charging? And then same thing, what are some of the other towns, how are they handling it?
Sure.
I know there's been, discussions about, some alternative approaches to this and all that. So I think, I guess here at the meeting, just offer, we'll talk about it as a group, but offer to the board that this would be something where, perhaps few thoughts on what to do this year, but, I think this would be an interesting project for us to take on going forward. I mean, the other big thing that jumped out at me is that we've really had a free ride in terms of maintaining the system. I mean, some group of Radnor residents paid to build the system, over time, but many years ago, and effectively the sewer rent we're paying is not paying that off at all and not contributing it to maintaining it. So, boy, if the system had to be recreated today, it's got to be hundreds of millions of dollars to recreate it. Not to mention even just probably a much smaller amount to maintain it. So I think, we've really had the advantage of not having to bear the costs of whatever it costs to build it in the first place. But anyway, I think that'd be a interesting project, and I don't know we want to discuss it all, but I would assume that we'd be happy to take that on as a potential project for next year.
I can't speak for the rest of the committee, but it's interesting to me. And again, we'll be looking to meet with the board in January, presumably, to ask them how we might be able to help them with their analytical needs. So this would definitely be something that we can bring up as a proposal. Certainly, it's pretty clear to me something is going to have to be done here. We can't not look at this as a township, because it's just going to bite us in a general fund and so forth and make problems.
I mean, I think the other thing we need to look into too is, the biggest payment is to RHM. So, not to get into too much detail here, but we're responsible for maintaining the infrastructure within Radnor. But then RHM then picks it up, carries it through Haverford, carries it, then I guess RHM pays Springfield to carry it there, and then I think there's Delcora, and then there's
It ultimately goes to
Philadelphia.
Delcora.
So the question is, all down the line, are those entities, properly accounting for or saving for their infrastructure needs? And then not to mention all kinds of DEP things coming down. So I think, that's going to be looked at as part of it. So, the Radnor part of it's important, but in terms of what we're facing, there's a lot to look into what's underneath some of these numbers. One really detailed question, just when I started to look at this, and I don't know if you have the answer or not, but the special assessment fund is essentially, that's related to this. That's where the township funded sewer improvements that individual homeowners are responsible for, and basically took out some bond money to cover that, and those residents pay it back over time, if I've got that right.
That's right.
It has a balance in it, a small balance. Is that something that's available, or is that prepayments that people have made? It looked like a couple of years ago in one chunk that all of a sudden that balance jumped up.
Yeah, okay, so, so your assessment, that'll be redundant. Your summation of that fund, the assessment fund, is accurate. The township, going back to the bond issuances that I was referring to before, the big chunks at a time, part of that was for special assessment projects. So the assessments that we're collecting on now, all of those dollars really should go towards the payment of the bonds. because the agreement with the residents is based on frontage or linear foot of pipe installed. Their share of the total project cost was X, and that includes both the bond principal and the bond interest calculation at the time when the bonds are taken out. That's what's presented to the homeowner. So as we collect those assessments, the transfer is going to the debt service fund. The variance is that you might have someone sell their house, and part of the negotiation for the sale of that house is the current homeowner is required to pay off the entire amount of the assessment. The new owner doesn't want it. So we'll get a one-time influx of someone paying off the entire portion of their assessment. Alternatively, you could have at the time the assessment is entered into, a lien is placed on the home. So there are some cases where the home ultimately is collected on through the lien process, or the assessment's collected on through the lien process. So we'll get an influx of cash there. I would say that there is a small fund balance in that fund. But those dollars really belong to the bond retirement fund for that reason.
Okay, thanks.
Quickie, how long do homeowners under that program have to pay off what's the horizon of time?
Yeah, the maturity is the same length as the bonds, the township, so 20 years. In almost every case, 20 years. We could do shorter or longer bonds, but the township's always done 20. And the last assessment that was done by the township was in the 2007 range, that time frame. This slide was meant to help kind of set the table for the next discussions with the board, kind of laying out different broad-based options for them to consider, to include pursuing other opportunities with the system. We can get into a little bit more of that at a future meeting. Park and Open Space Fund, this one's pretty straightforward. The amount of revenue that's deposited in the fund is from the realty transfer tax. The township transfer or deposits 1/4 of our revenue into this fund for the purpose of paying for open space. What this is showing is that over the next few years, the amount of realty transfer revenues, albeit that we're showing some growth there, these are very unpredictable, as you guys are aware. We are showing some growth, but the debt service in each of the years is going to be roughly $200,000 from 2018 to 21, roughly $200,000 short. So the board's going to have to come up with direction on how they would like to fund it. For purposes of this presentation, two alternatives were presented. One was enacting a millage, a voted millage. We estimated 0.05 mils. That doesn't quite get us there. 0.06 mils does, but we're trying to avoid a situation where the millage was causing the fund to start generating a balance.
A quick question for you. This would include the Ardrossan purchase, correct?
Yep, that's most of what this debt service number is paying for the Ardrossan.
Well, I have a dim recollection that certain pledges were made to contribute to the cost of the purchase, and I never heard whether or not those pledges were actually delivered to the township and what the scope of those was. I think $1 million or something, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, if you might be referring to the grant that we had from the state. Remember, the purchase price was in the ballpark of 12 million and change. We received a $1 million grant from the state, and then we used some general fund dollars to help bring the total borrowing for the purchase down below 10 million. And if you recall, we did that to make sure that the borrowing was bank qualified, which gave us better rates. So if the $1 million pledge you're referring to as the grant, we did receive that.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
I thought that some of the local institutions had pledged money. I might be completely off base. Had there not been,
Now, there was a lot of discussions during some of the board meetings, folks insisting that the township should be doing more to raise money that way versus borrowing money and putting it on the taxpayers. So, but none of that was officially part of the funding plan.
okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
I just didn't know.
The one thing that is changed from the plan as discussed in 2014 to where we are now is that the estimated millage needed at that time was 0.15 mils. We're using, if the board were to consider this, we're using 0.05 mils. So the needed millage has come down mostly as a result of the realty transfer tax doing better than we thought it would do when we were sitting here 4 years ago. So that is one change. Now, the board has never enacted the millage to pay in any year's worth of debt service on this. In each of the years, they've come up with another mechanism to pay for it. 2017, so when we were sitting here a year ago having this discussion, the board ultimately came to the decision to transfer some of the excess general fund balance from 15 to cover the gap for this year, and that's what this $400,000 represents from 2016. So that was a one-time. At the board's direction, they have instructed us that they want to make this decision annually. So it's back in front of them again now. The alternative to levying the millage, the board could consider just transferring general fund dollars. In the theme of trying to develop planning, long-term or multiple-year financial planning, what was presented here with this slide is the board could just say, look, over the next, so it's roughly 8 years, through 2026, additional revenue will be needed to fund all of the debt service unless the realty transfer tax just goes through the roof, which is, I'm not sure how realistic it is to assume that is even a possibility. So the board could say, all right, from 2018 through 2026, we're going to put $200,000 in this fund, or a maximum of $200,000, or the number could be less, just what is needed to balance the fund on an annual basis, again, to prevent the fund from accumulating a large balance. In any case, it's only needed through 2026 because the old open space bonds will mature. Then the remaining payments for just the Ardrossan piece will be less than what we would anticipate the realty transfer tax generating anyway, so no additional revenue or sources would be needed from that point moving forward. So for what the township manager was presenting was the two different alternatives. You could consider levying the tax or consider transferring general fund dollars. In either case, the board has said they want to evaluate this annually. They still can, even if they say, look, our policy moving forward is to transfer general fund dollars. They could always change that year over year. But we're trying to move the conversations toward more of a set plan so we know how to budget.
Either way, it comes out of our pockets.
Either way.
Right.
Well, in one form or another. The general fund transfer is a little less directly out of your pocket. I mean, it comes out of all of the resources of the township, not just real estate taxes.
It would seem that the more transparent way to do it would be to assess millage for that purpose, just in terms of being clear about things, but that's just.
Yeah, well,
my
that's,
perspective.
you get into a lot of philosophy and political convictions, but yes, if to tie it dollar for dollar and make everything button up real nice and neat, I would agree. But there's a lot of things that the township does that we don't. I mean, we don't take our current millage, other than the amount that was increased in 2016 for the bonds, the library, park, and trail bonds. Other than that, we don't take that millage and slice it up and make it specific towards programs. It goes into the pot and is allocated by the board from there. But, I mean, that conversation's a very philosophical one, and people have varying degrees of passion toward it.
I understand, thank you.
But again, going back to the way it was presented here was to try to set the table more towards a long-term plan versus a year-over-year, revisiting of the topic. And this slide is just basically setting that table up. So just recapping on what is being presented is no change in the real estate tax rate for our operations, or at least the pay-as-you-go portion of the capital. No change in the stormwater fee. We're still looking for direction with regard to the fire company, the community organizations. If the board agrees with what the township manager is presenting in terms of changes in their funding, then our larger the pay-as-you-use, or the infrastructure portion of our capital program, our sanitary sewer fund, and then to a much smaller extent, our park and open space fund. So I laid out the next steps. Monday night will be the 23rd, at which time the board will be asked to adopt the township manager recommended budget as the preliminary budget. That's to satisfy a charter requirement. It's basically to kind of set the baseline budget for future discussions and changes from there. And then there are some public hearings that are scheduled on the 13th and 27th. We're anticipating talking a little bit about capital Monday night. And then there are public hearings, there are nights that have been kind of carved out and available to the board if they want to schedule. The October 30th has already been zapped. There's a candidates forum that was scheduled for that night, but we still have November 20th and December 4th. Ultimately, the budget needs to be adopted by December 11th, which means that the ordinances need to be introduced on the 27th. And at this point, at least when it was presented to the board, each of the departments came up and gave a synopsis of their operations. They didn't get into the financial aspects of their departments. That's kind of baked into these numbers, but they revisited what their department does, who does it, and the successes and the fact that they do their jobs pretty well.
I was unable to watch the meeting or attend it. I just wonder if you could attempt to characterize the reaction of the board to the manager's professional recommendations here, or?
I think the reaction is okay. We know what it is that we have to talk about. I think if I could be so bold as to say that I think there was a consensus that no one wanted to raise taxes. No one made a motion and passed it, but no one was saying that was a bad idea. But there wasn't really a whole lot of discussion after the presentation because it was the first time the board was hearing about it or hearing the numbers officially. But the reaction was, okay, we'll go to Monday the 23rd, and that'll kind of start the process from there.
So the games are just beginning. But
Yeah.
I'm very encouraged.
Yeah. I may be naive and have Mr. Tate's rose-colored glasses on, but the fact that a lot of the major components of the budget are set already by other policies already adopted by the board, unless we're going to revisit those, most of what the underlying numbers are being based off of is set. The org chart was set. We have labor agreements with our unions for multiple years, so that's set, which includes the new health care program, which is a savings to the township. And again, we have our pension that we spent a great deal of time on narrowing down and getting an understanding on. The OPEB funding plan is working, and we've stuck with it. We've got a significant chunk of our capital program identified and is now being funded. So I guess we're whittling down the list of things that require a lot of attention and debate. Obviously, the ones that are remaining are going to be significant discussions, and we'll see where that goes.
So
Thank you.
this is a good presentation, but what you said clearly is that this is based upon the information that is available, specifically dealing with revenue, dealing with expenses. It is cash basis. What this does not take into consideration are the lost opportunity that we have within the township because of not collecting revenue, that if certain things had passed, the township, us as residents, there would be more revenue and potentially to be able to handle other aspects within the township. Am I correct?
Absolutely. I mean, for those of you who've been on this committee for long enough, there were projects a few years ago that had a very positive net revenue impact to the township's budget. And ultimately, those other aspects of those were determined to outweigh the financial impact. So
And then-
for one reason or another, they weren't enacted on.
And again, we're talking about both infrastructure, revenue components, and yearly ongoing revenue as far as the general fund is concerned and potentially certain other funds.
Absolutely. There's actually a small portion in the executive summary of the budget, the township manager's budget. I don't put it into this presentation, but we talk about the importance of the business taxes. When we look at our millage rate and how it has been able to remain constant for a long period of time now, is entirely due to development and business growth. The business taxes are growing and are growing sufficiently enough to cover our increased costs year over year. And then you throw in on top of that the development from some of the large, like the Villanova project. Those are the only portions of our revenue that's growing. And so I actually go into detail in the executive summary what our millage rate would look like without the business taxes. Just to, again, kind of demonstrate the importance of that element to the community.
Lost opportunity that we have as far as the business taxes really is significant to us as residents. Depending on which project we're talking about. And these are permanent pieces of revenue that are gone. In the past, we can't make that up. All we could do is something finally gets approved, gets passed by the board, which is something they do need to consider, because that is money that's really coming out of our pockets as residents.
Yeah, and I think it was brought up earlier with regard to the amount included in the capital for signalization. Part of that is to improve traffic flow in some of our more congested areas, and it's certainly not outside the realm of appropriateness to ask a developer to help offset those costs. And without the opportunity to do that, the burden falls on the tax base.
Bill,
If you've been watching the last few meetings, we're also now coming up with a funding plan for dollars to invest into the Willows Mansion, to renovate a part of the mansion to make it operational again, coming off of the business plan that was presented to the board. Yeah, I mean, it's not difficult from a mathematical standpoint. If you don't have revenue from other sources, at the end of the day, the ultimate burden falls on taxpayers.
But that whole, the Willows thing is the most inane thing to spend money on that after where we were. I mean, to me, that is a total waste of money when we had someone that was going to go in there, pay us rent over time, increase it, take care of all the operational expenses of the township, would be able to have more use of the Willows, and they would have renovated it themselves in the township. So the fact that the township now is thinking about spending money on the Willows after they passed up is very, very poor management, to say the least. So I can't believe that that's what they're doing. But just getting back to Ed's concern, we've passed up so many opportunities. I don't know why, but to spend money, and I've talked to some of the commissioners. I said, I'm not going to go up and talk about it because it's a conflict for me to be on CARFAC to go in front of the public, but now I can do that. It is blasphemy to think about spending money on that right now. We had 2 bites out of the apple. The last one was huge. And that was a winner. That was a no-brainer. That was about the same, as much as a no-brainer as doing the public-private with Agnes Irwin on Memorial Field. I mean, really.
Thank you for voicing that strong opinion. I understand that. The only question that I would have finally is that, as it happens, this happens to be an election year, and the drop-dead date on the budget is December 11, as I recall, and the elections are in November, but officers aren't in place until January. Is that how it works? I wasn't paying attention 4 years ago. How did everything work smoothly despite the change in government?
Yes.
Possible?
The charter actually allows, if there is if a new board wants to come in and change the budget, there's a window of time at the beginning of the year that they're able to change it. Now, the board has the authority to adopt ordinances at any point, so they could change the budget at any time. The one element that it's a little bit harder for a new board to affect is the real estate taxes, because we are required to send our millage rate to the county mid-December, which obviously does not give a new board an opportunity to revisit that before they're in office. So that has not happened since I've been here. Again, I don't think that'll be a concern this time, just because the tax rate's not changing. But if there is a new board and they want to lower it, I'm not sure if that'll be possible, because the county will have already accepted our millage rate and run the bills, or are ready to send the bills out. So haven't had to work that out logistically yet. But to your point, there is language in the charter that gives a new board the ability to come in and immediately affect the budget.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for the clarification. You're complete, Bill?
Yes, sir.
Your presentation? Okay. Not aware of any old business, and we have no public here today, so I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We're adjourned. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.